It happened in the summer of 1939 on the platform of Union Station in Chicago. The war hadn't started yet, not officially, but the air already carried a kind of tension you could feel in your chest. I had just enlisted. Infantry training at Fort Leonard Wood. They told us it would be quick. In and out. No more than a couple of months, they said. I believed it. Or maybe I wanted to. She came to see me off. Anna. She wore a light blue dress and held a small white handkerchief in her hand, like something out of an old black and white movie. I remember thinking she looked like the last peaceful moment before everything fell apart. We didn't have the right words. We were too young, too afraid of saying something final, so I smiled and said something foolish. 2 months. I'll be back with a medal. She didn't laugh. She just nodded and squeezed my hand so tightly it felt like she could hold back the future. And then the train pulled in. We kissed once. Soft, quick, unsure. It wasn't the kind of kiss you see in war movies. It wasn't dramatic or full of passion. It was something smaller, quieter, a promise, a hope, the kind of kiss that says, "Remember me, please." I watched her from the train window as we pulled away. Her dress caught the wind, her hand raised, that white handkerchief shaking slightly in the air. That image stayed with me for the next 40 years. That moment was the last I saw of her. The war didn't last 2 months. It lasted 6 years. It took everything. My youth, my certainty, my friends, and her. After the war, I looked for her, wrote letters, asked around, but she was gone. Her family's home was empty. There were rumors, a relocation, maybe France, maybe gone forever. Eventually, I stopped asking. I married, I had kids, but I never stopped remembering. Every now and then, I'd go back to Union Station and sit on that same platform, just to feel close to something I lost. To see if maybe, just maybe, she'd walk out of a crowd and recognize me. And then, in the fall of 1979, it came. A letter. No name, no return address, just a note, handwritten in a style I hadn't seen in decades. "I'll be there next Sunday." That was it. 4 words. But I knew. My hands shook as I read it. My heart, old and quiet for so long, suddenly remembered how to race. Could it really be her? I packed a bag and returned to the place where it all began, Union Station, Platform 3, and what happened next. Well, you'll want to hear this. If this story touches you the way it moved me to write it, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next changes everything. I arrived early, too early probably. The trains weren't even crowded yet, and the morning sun was still climbing its way between the buildings downtown, throwing long shadows across the platform outside Union Station in Chicago. The same place where I last saw her, the same track, the same direction of light slanting through the glass. But I was not the same man. The last time I stood there, I was a boy dressed in a new uniform, full of naive confidence and trembling nerves, pretending I understood what war was. Now I was 60. My back ached in the mornings, my hands weren't as steady, and I'd buried a wife and raised 2 children who thought I'd told them everything about my life. But I hadn't. Not about Anna. I walked through the terminal slowly, taking in the changes. The coffee shops were new, the benches looked cleaner, and there were now monitors blinking out arrivals and departures. But beneath the polish, the bones of the old station were still there. The arches, the marble floors, the echo of shoes striking tile, the scent of metal, concrete, and distant places. I paused near track 3, my hands in my coat pockets, and let the memories come without fighting them. It was here, right here, where I watched her wave that handkerchief, where she stood in that blue dress, where we said too little and let too much go unsaid. I'd spent decades trying to forget just enough to move on, but never so much that I lost the memory completely. The letter was still in my pocket. 4 words, handwritten with no return address. "I'll be there next Sunday." That was all she'd written. That was all I needed. I didn't tell anyone, didn't ask for advice or check with anyone else who might remember her. I didn't want this moment to belong to anyone but us. I sat down, on one of the wooden benches along the platform. Not the same one, of course, that had been replaced years ago, but close enough. I crossed my legs, folded my hands in my lap, and watched the world rush past me. People hurrying for their trains, porters rolling carts, children tugging at their parents' coats. Everyone seemed to be in motion, like the whole city was trying to outrun time itself. I wasn't running anymore. I'd done my share of chasing ghosts, of pretending I could recreate the past. This was different. This was about standing still long enough for time to come full circle. I remembered the last letter I got from her. It was 1940. She said her family was being relocated, but she didn't know where. Said she'd write again, but she never did. And I never stopped wondering what happened. Bombing. Relocation, emigration, marriage, death? When you lose someone during war, there's no clean answer. There's just silence. And silence is a terrible companion. I used to sit on that bench once a year. Every November, without telling my wife, I'd come back to this station and watch the trains. I told myself it was nostalgia, but it was her. It was always her. The hours passed slowly. My eyes scanned every woman who walked by. Most were too young. Some were the right age, but something in their walk or the tilt of their head told me it wasn't her. And then, just after 11, a train from upstate pulled in. The usual bustle followed. People gathering bags, checking phones, looking for signs. And then I saw her. At first I wasn't sure. She was thinner than I remembered, her hair white, her step slower. But when she turned, I saw her face. And I knew, instantly, it was her. She was holding a white handkerchief. I stood slowly. My legs felt stiff, but my heart was pounding like I was 20 again. We didn't speak at first. We just stared. The station blurred around us. The noise of trains, announcements, people, it all faded until there was only the sound of my own breath, shaky and deep. She smiled, and it was the same smile. My God, after all these years, it was still hers. When I left Chicago that day in 1939, boarding the train that would take me to basic training, I carried very little with me. Just a folded letter from my commanding officer, a wallet with $5 and a photo of my parents, a watch that didn't always keep time, and the image of Anna on the platform, her eyes wet and locked onto mine, as if she could hold me back by will alone. But I carried far more in my heart. The weight of hope, the fear of change, and the naive belief that whatever was coming wouldn't last long, that I would return to that same station in just a few short months with stories to tell, maybe a medal in my duffel and her waiting for me right where I left her. Fort Leonard Wood was hot, loud, and fast. They stripped us of everything that made us feel young, names, clothes, thoughts, and built us back as soldiers. And though I tried to keep her face clear in my mind, it began to blur with each long march, every shouted command, and the constant pressure to toughen up, shut up, and move forward, because sentiment had no place in formation, and love letters were something you wrote in private, but and only in secret, hoping no one saw the look on your face afterward. By early 1940, we were deployed, first to Europe, then deeper into its bleeding heart. And I found myself stationed in France during a time when no one was quite sure who held what ground on which day. The towns changed hands so quickly that we didn't bother learning the names anymore. Just the terrain and the nearest route out if things went bad, which they often did. The days were filled with mud and fear, and the strange rhythm of waiting for something awful to happen, and then surviving it just long enough for the next thing to come along. And every night, after the shouting quieted and the gunmetal taste of adrenaline faded from my tongue, I would sit in my cot, pull out the folded scrap of paper that still had her perfume faintly clinging to its fibers, and I would write her, page after page, letter after letter, telling her about my dreams, the sound of birds I barely heard over artillery, how I remembered the way her dress moved. In the station breeze, how her hand felt in mine, how I wished for nothing more than to see her smile again, if only for a second. I never received a reply. I told myself the mail was slow, that the war had rerouted deliveries, that maybe she'd moved or that my letters had gone missing. But deep down, A quiet part of me feared the worst, and that fear grew louder when, during a retreat near the Ardennes in late 41, I was captured. They marched us east, days on foot with little food, little rest, and no answers, until we reached a makeshift prison camp in the woods, cold as sin and twice as unforgiving, where we slept in damp quarters, worked until our hands cracked open, and spoke only when spoken to. And in those silent hours, when the frost etched patterns on the inside of the barrack windows, and death became just another morning routine, I clung to Anna. Not physically, not literally, but to the memory of her, to the way her voice sounded when she said my name, to the idea that someone, somewhere, might still be waiting for me. There was another man in my bunk, Corporal Dean from Ohio, who shared his last pencil stub with me and tore sheets from his pocket Bible so I could keep writing letters I knew I couldn't send. And I wrote them anyway, because writing her was like breathing, and breathing meant I was still alive. By the time liberation came, by the time we were finally pulled from that frozen hell and put on a transport back home, I was thin, tired, and older than my age, 25 going on 60, and though I should have felt joy, I felt mostly numb because I knew I wasn't returning to the same world I had left, and I certainly wasn't returning to the same version of me. When I got back to Chicago, everything had changed. Shops closed, buildings bombed, people gone, and I made my way to the last address I had for her, a brownstone just off Belmont Avenue, only to find the windows boarded and the neighbors unfamiliar. No one knew where her family had gone, and the landlord said they moved out in 42, quietly, in the middle of the night, and that was all he remembered. I searched. I asked around. I wrote to the Red Cross, the Army's Lost Persons Registry, the newspapers. I followed a rumor to New York, another to Canada, a third that said she'd died in London during a bombing raid, but nothing ever led me to her, and eventually I stopped chasing ghosts, because even hope begins to decay when fed on nothing but silence. I married in 1950, not because I stopped loving Anna, but because I had to believe that love was still possible, that life had more than one path, that something good could grow from everything I had lost. And my wife, God rest her soul, was good to me, gave me 2 fine children, a house, years of laughter and arguments and Christmas mornings, but she never knew that part of my heart remained at Union Station, waiting, on a bench that no longer existed, searching faces in every crowd. And all that time I kept the letters, hers, the one I never received, mine, the ones I never sent. I kept them in a box under my bed, beside the old photo of her I carried through Europe, through war, through frost and fire and back again. And though the world kept turning, I never really stopped waiting. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October, the kind of cold, quiet day that seems to fold in on itself, when the light outside the kitchen window turned a soft gray, and the wind carried the smell of burning leaves from somewhere down the block. And I remember walking out to the mailbox, expecting nothing more than the usual gas bill, junk advertisements, maybe a birthday card from my niece in Ohio, if I was lucky, and finding instead an envelope that didn't belong to this decade or even this life. There was no return address, no postal barcode, no printed label, just my full name written in blue ink, with a hand I hadn't seen in 40 years, but recognized instantly, like my bones remembered it better than my eyes could. And the moment I touched the paper, I felt something inside me drop, sharp and sudden and real. I stood on the porch for a long time, the envelope resting in my palm, unopened, my heart pounding in a way it hadn't since my early 30s, when I first held my son in the delivery room, or maybe even earlier, back in France, when a letter from home was the only thing that could make you feel like the world still made sense. Inside the envelope, folded so neatly, it made me wonder how long she'd sat at the table deciding whether to send it, was a single line of handwriting. "I'll be there next Sunday." That was it. No date, no explanation, no name. But I didn't need any of those things because I knew that handwriting, knew it better than my own, knew the way she curled her S, the way her lines tilted gently upward as if even her pen believed in hope. I sat in the kitchen with the letter resting on the table like a sacred relic, and for the first time in decades, I let the full weight of her memory return. Not just the image of her on the platform in that pale blue dress. Not just the imagined scenarios I'd invented to keep myself sane during the war or in the years after when I searched through records and phone books and eventually learned to stop, but the real her. The sound of her laugh in summer, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the way she looked at me that morning, like she knew something I didn't. In the days that followed, I didn't tell anyone, not my children, not my neighbors, not the men I had breakfast with every Friday at the diner, because this moment wasn't meant to be shared, wasn't meant to be explained, wasn't meant to belong to anyone but us. When Sunday came, I woke before the sun, dressed slowly, carefully, choosing the same coat I wore to my wife's funeral and slipping the letter into the inside pocket, along with the photograph of Anna that I'd kept for all those years, creased at the corners, faded almost to a whisper but still hers, and I boarded the early train downtown with the kind of silent anticipation that belongs not to excitement, but to reverence. Union Station hadn't changed entirely, though it had been polished and upgraded and crowded with a different kind of noise. No longer the harsh echo of train whistles and shouted orders, but the digital beeps of cell phones and the casual clatter of rolling suitcases. Still, the marble arches stood where they had always been, and the sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows in almost exactly the same way it had on that morning in 1939, as if the station itself remembered. I made my way to track 3, sat on a bench that wasn't the same one, but close enough, and waited. Watched the people pass, the travelers, the lovers, the businessmen and backpackers, the mothers with tired arms and the teenagers with their headphones and ambition. And I let time slow to a crawl, my breath steady, but my pulse quickening every time the door opened. For over an hour, I sat in silence, replaying the war in my head. Not the violence or the blood, but the long stretches of waiting, the letters I wrote and never sent, the stories I carried without a listener. And then, just past 11, a train from the north pulled in, and through the glass I saw her. She moved slowly, more carefully than I remembered. Her shoulders narrower, her frame lighter, but when she turned, and she turned like someone looking for something they once buried and now hoped to unearth, I saw her face, and I knew, without hesitation, without breath, it was her. She held a white handkerchief in her hand, not the same one, of course, but the gesture was unmistakable, like a signal sent across time. And she saw me then, eyes meeting eyes, no sound between us, just the weight of everything that hadn't been said. And she smiled. The same smile, that quiet, half-shy, heart-cracking smile I'd carried through war, through grief, through years of silence. We didn't speak for a long moment. She walked toward me, slowly, steadily, the way people walk when they know exactly where they're going. And when she reached me, she said only, "I didn't think you'd still be here." I smiled back. I never left. She invited me to her apartment without hesitation, as if no years had passed between us, as if we were simply continuing a conversation paused mid-sentence, and I followed her through the city like a man in a dream, watching the way she walked, slower now, more deliberate, but still with that same quiet grace that had once made my heart beat faster on train platforms and sidewalk corners, and I realized with each step that there was something sacred about walking beside someone who had once lived only in memory. Her place was modest, tucked into a quiet building just off Sheridan Road, not far from the lake, and as we climbed the narrow stairwell, her hand grazing the wall for balance, my hand inches behind her back in case she needed me, I felt like I was being welcomed into a preserved part of the past, one that had waited in silence for decades, just for this moment to breathe again. Inside, it smelled like chamomile tea, old books, and time. Time in the way that sunlight filtered through lace curtains. Time in the quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Time in the dust that shimmered in the air like memory made visible. And I stood just inside the doorway, not wanting to break the spell, until she turned to me and said softly, "Come in, make yourself at home." And I did. Because home was not a place, not really, but a presence, and she was that presence. Her living room was lined with shelves, filled not just with books, but with photographs, keepsakes, letters bundled in string, and I could see that her life had been full of people, of places, of things I hadn't been part of, and yet, when she turned to me with eyes that still held that soft urgency, I knew that somehow I had been there all along, hidden in the corners of her mind, just as she had been in mine. She brought out a box from the top of a closet, an old wooden one, scratched and worn, but carefully kept, and opened it on the coffee table between us, revealing stacks of letters, each one written in a hand I didn't recognize at first. Until I realized they were hers, younger versions of her voice, speaking across time, telling stories she'd never had the chance to send. "I wrote them," she said, her voice catching like an old vinyl skipping, "but there was no way to deliver them. Not then, not where I was. And later, I didn't know if you were even alive." She had been taken from Chicago in 1942, relocated with her family to a German-occupied town near the Belgian border, later separated, then smuggled across to France by resistance fighters. She spent the remainder of the war as a nurse's aide in a refugee hospital near Marseille, then came to New York in 1947, married a man she'd met on the boat, had no children, and lost him in 1965 to a heart attack. 13 years of marriage, quiet, functional, never quite full. "I always thought of you," she said, "every time I heard a train, every time I saw a man in uniform, every time I found one of these." And she held up one of the letters, yellowed and bent at the corners, the ink slightly faded but the words still clear. "I miss the way you said goodbye without ever really saying it." We read them together, her words and mine, the ones I had kept in my own box, stored under my bed for so long, I had started to believe they belonged to someone else. And in the silence between paragraphs, I heard the rhythm of our lives returning to us, syncopated but still connected, like two pieces of the same song, finally brought back into harmony. She smiled at me then. Not the formal smile she'd given at the station, not the nostalgic one she wore when we first locked eyes again, but the real one, the one I had fallen in love with, the one that had stayed with me through war and loss and silence, the one that belonged only to her and could never be imitated, and in that moment I cried. Not the kind of crying that comes from pain or grief, but the kind that spills from a heart that has been full for too long and suddenly finds release. I let the tears fall, didn't bother hiding them, because if there was one person in the world I could be completely honest with, it was her. "Do you think," I asked, my voice quiet, careful, "we still have time?" She reached for my hand, her fingers thinner than I remembered, but just as steady, and she said, "We have what we have, and that's more than I ever thought we'd get." We spent the night talking, not about everything, but about enough, about the places we'd been, the people we'd loved, the versions of ourselves we'd had to become to survive. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the years began to melt away, not erased, but softened, like a photograph taken in sunlight and aged to sepia. She fell asleep on the couch, her head on my shoulder, the box of letters resting on the table in front of us, like a shrine to everything we had once lost and now somehow reclaimed. And I sat there for a long time, listening to her breathe, feeling her warmth and thinking simply, after everything, after all the silence, all the years, all the questions, she's here and she's smiling again. It's been over 40 years since that Sunday morning on the platform, and I still remember the sound of her voice when she said my name again, as if no time had passed, as if we had never been lost to one another, as if the world had waited patiently for us to find our way back through war, through silence, through all the things we thought had ended us. We didn't rush into anything, not because we were unsure, but because we understood something that youth never does. That love, real love, the kind that survives decades and distance and death itself, doesn't require speed or declarations or urgency. It only needs presence, honesty, and the willingness to sit beside someone long enough for them to know they're no longer alone. Every Sunday now, we sit together on a bench near the lake, not far from her apartment, where the wind brushes gently through the trees and the light dances on the surface of the water in that quiet, familiar way that reminds me of train windows and the shimmer of a white handkerchief in summer air. And we talk, not always about the past, not always about the years we lost, but about books, music, the way people move too fast these days, as if rushing towards something might make them whole. She still calls me her soldier, says it with a smile that makes my chest ache in the best possible way. And every time she does, I reach for her hand, and she lets me hold it, her fingers curled into mine like they never left, like they never had to. We never had children together. Life didn't give us that. But her niece visits often, brings us coffee and stories. And when she introduces me to her own grandchildren, she says, "This is the man my aunt never stopped loving." And somehow, that feels truer than anything I've ever heard. The letters, hers and mine, now rest together in a single wooden box on the shelf in our living room, wrapped in the same blue ribbon she kept for decades. And every so often, when the weather turns grey or when the world feels heavy, we open that box and read one or two aloud, our voices quiet, our eyes misty, and then we smile at each other, not because the pain is gone, but because we know it way. Is all real. Time didn't steal her from me, it just delayed her return. And now, every evening before she sleeps, I kiss her forehead, the way I imagined I would on the train ride back from war, when I still believed in reunions, but didn't know if I would ever have one. And I whisper to her what I never got to say when we were young. I'm here. I never stopped waiting. Because in the end, all we really want is to be remembered, to be seen. And if you're lucky, to be loved across time, across miles, across silence, until the day you are found again. We share new stories every day, true stories that touch, inspire, and remind us that love, like memory, can outlast everything. Leave a comment, give us a like, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive.